I'm Autumn Lockett.
And this is Mitch Randall.
And you're listening to Good Faith Weekly.
Welcome to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, Autumn and I are going to catch up real quick. And then we've got two special interviews for this episode. We're first going to sit down with the executive director and editor of Baptist News Global, Mark Wingfield, as Mark talks about the 2021 Southern Baptist Convention and all the glory it was. And then later on in the pod, Autumn and I had the distinct pleasure of sitting down with Reverend June Joplin. Reverend Joplin came out last year in a sermon identifying as a transgender woman, and she is just an absolute delight, and you will not want to miss that interview. So stay tuned.
I'm Reverend Starlette Thomas, a womanist in ministry and the host of a new podcast, The Raceless Gospel, from Good Faith Media. We're going to talk about that taboo trinity: race, religion, and politics. Season 1 of The Raceless Gospel has 5 episodes, 5 Sundays, if you will. We're going to take you to church each episode. We're going to talk about the sticks and stones, the skin and bones of Christian discipleship through the structure of a church service. And each episode, we're joined by a special guest who will bring a word. The Raceless Gospel Podcast, 5 episodes, all available March 22nd. I'm your podcast pastor, Reverend Starlette Thomas. Join us as we march into and beyond race, religion, and politics. Learn more at goodfaithmedia.org.
Autumn, I survived the SBC 2021.
Yeah, well, we weren't in Nashville with them, and so I think that's probably a big key in our survival.
Yeah, I did put up a plexiglass between me and my screen just to make certain none got on me.
Yeah, no, there's not enough germ gel left in the world post-COVID. Bless them. I mean, I just don't know. Like, I just always think about that line in Fiddler on the Roof when they ask the rabbi, "Rabbi, is there a prayer for the czar?" And the rabbi says, "The Lord bless and keep the czar far away from here." That's sort of how I feel about the SBC. The Southern Baptist Convention, for those of you who don't know.
Right. Well, God bless them. I grew up a Southern Baptist. I know you did as well. I always do give them extreme credit for laying a great biblical foundation for me as a child. I did have great growing up experiences in the church. Certainly started to see changes in Southern Baptist life during the 1980s as they moved more and more to a conservative bent until it was just full-blown fundamentalism at one point. And of course, as the story goes, Baptists like us were ushered out of the building and formed the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship and the Alliance Baptist and some other denominations. And some of us went to the Methodist Church, to the UCC Church. There's this big diaspora of Baptists all across the country. And to be quite honest with you, when I left and did not anticipate having to go back to a Southern Baptist Convention. But now, as part of the media, we covered the event, even though we covered it virtually. And it was interesting to kind of step back into that space, even virtually, to just feel like you're getting beat up on for no good reason. I mean, they just take pot shots all the time at other people. And it's just like, okay, you guys, you do what you're doing, but I just don't understand it.
Yeah, there's something about it, though. We were talking with someone else off air yesterday who came from sort of that Southern Baptist tradition and is now doing, completely different things. And it's sort of like I spent some time in my youth in Lubbock, Texas, and people like to toot toot, right? Exactly. I have the grit stains in my eyes, like the scars to prove it. But people like to say about Lubbock that it's a good place to be from, meaning like you don't stay there. It's sort of a fertile ground. And I think about that from the SBC because there are so many powerful movers and shakers who didn't get stuck there. Yeah. It was a good foundation. salt of the earth people. Like some of the people I love the most in the world belong to the SBC tradition.
Sure.
But yeah, it's just hard to watch.
And to all of our Lubbock listeners, you can send your emails to autumn at goodfaithmedia.org.
They know. They know it's a good place to be from. They know.
Well, you and I got the pleasure to sit down with Mark Wingfield this week from Baptist News Global and talk about the Southern Baptist Convention. A lot of interesting things happened this week that Mark talks about in more detail. And so, it's going to be a good interview. Hope everybody listening enjoys it. And then after we talked to Mark, we got to sit down with June Joplin. And I mean, gosh, is there any better person in the world than Reverend June Joplin?
No, although I did get a little lost when y'all started talking about hockey. Because the only thing I know about hockey is what I Google while I'm watching Letterkenny. I'm like, what does that mean? What does that mean?
Yeah, we started chirping a little bit about the
gosh.
hockey playoffs. June and I share a passion for hockey, so that was a good conversation. Well, stay tuned for these two interviews. They are both are wonderful and has nothing to do with Autumn and I, but well, a lot to do with Autumn, but not so much me. But the guests are just outstanding. So stay tuned.
They are.
Welcome back to Good Faith Weekly, and our first guest on the show this week is Mark Wingfield. Mark serves as Executive Director and Publisher of Baptist News Global. His offices are located in Dallas. Before he became Executive Director of BNG, he was an Associate Pastor at Wilshire Baptist Church in Dallas for almost 17 years, and before that was in journalism for 21 years. So he's got a lot of experience, and we're looking forward to talking to him. He's also a professional journalism throughout those years, regular opinion columnist for both BNG and Dallas Morning News. Mark, it is great to have you with us at Good Faith Weekly.
Thank you. A little exhausted from following the SBC this week, but let's talk about it.
Oh, man. Well, that's what we brought you on here for today. First of all, let me just say Baptist News Global did an outstanding job this week covering the details of the meeting there in Nashville. Kudos to you and your team. I thought you guys did an outstanding job.
Thank you. You often say that even for folks in the SBC, we're sort of the news source in the brown paper wrapper. People inside the SBC read us, but can't admit that they do.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Mm-hmm. That's right. So Mark, let's just get to it right off the bat. I mean, you were an associate pastor for 17 years at Wilshire. I was a pastor for 20-something years in Texas and Oklahoma. And now both of us find ourselves in the media world. I don't know about you, but during those years in ministry in local churches, I never went to the Southern Baptist Convention, and it was glorious. But now we find ourselves back in the fold, having to attend and cover these events, even though they're virtual.
Yeah, so, I worked 21 years in the denomination and was at every SBC during that time, pretty much, most of that time, as a working journalist. So been there a lot, seen all the stuff. But watching the SBC this year and attending virtually was the first time I had participated in an SBC annual meeting in 20 years.
Right.
And so in a way, it's like going back home and finding that the furniture is all still in the same place and the wallpaper is still the same. It's just that there's, different people walking through there.
Yeah.
A lot has changed, but a lot has not changed. And it's so funny. I think the funniest thing I noticed, not funny haha, but funny odd, is the definition of a moderate now. Because back when we were attending the SBC, we were the moderates,
right?
Which was then and now it's a slam as someone who's liberal. But who counts as a moderate in the SBC today is nowhere near what any of us were when we were labeled moderates. It's just the same label on people way, way to the right of us.
Right. Yeah. Let's just talk about that on the top here, because strange to open up New York Times, Washington Post this week and see that a moderate is now the president of the Southern Baptist Convention. There was some concern at the SBC that the ultra conservative group, head by Mike Stone, who was a candidate for president, would win the presidency. He was defeated only by 4.71%, which translates into a little over, I think, 500 votes, or
500 votes.
Yeah,
yes.
556 votes. He was defeated by Ed Litton from Alabama, who, as the Times and Post reported, was a moderate in Southern Baptist life. But, I mean, Mark, is the SBC moderate?
There's nothing moderate about the SBC. So I think you've got to consider that you have this, just imagine a long, wide spectrum of religion in American life. If you could see me, you could see me stretching out my arms as far as they reach.
Right, sure.
There's the spectrum. And go to the right side of that. And within there's a small segment that represents the Southern Baptist Convention. So if you focus in on that small segment, yes, Ed Litton is a moderate within that small segment. That does not make him a moderate within the larger scope of American religion. And the other interesting thing is, maybe I never heard of Ed Litton before this. And I think a lot of people have never heard of Ed before this. And he seems, by all accounts, to be a nice guy. And by the way, his immediate predecessor, J.D. Greer, who's also very conservative but kind, did a tremendous job in moderating. I mean, one of the best presiding jobs I've ever seen at a Southern Baptist Convention. The guy was smooth and gracious and really efficient in what he did. So, two big thumbs up to him. But within this narrow spectrum that represents the Southern Baptist Convention, there is this battle going on, and it seems to be between sort of unity and purity are the labels that I've used. So Ed Litton represents unity, whatever that means, and Mike Stone represents purity, because there's this conservative, ultra conservative wing that you mentioned that is all about doctrinal purity and demanding uniformity on things.
But Mark, haven't we heard this song? Haven't we heard this song before?
Yeah, we've danced to this song before. Same song, 103rd verse. It's just there's different people on the dance floor.
Yeah, and it seems like this is the natural progression of fundamentalist theology, is that you constantly have to be outing or rooting out, I should say, using your words, unpure theology and belief systems. That's the only way for fundamentalism to truly thrive, is when it has somebody or something to attack. And,
yeah, that's what I learned in seminary. Fundamentalism always has to have an enemy.
Right.
Yeah, and we see that playing out. Absolutely. Yeah.
And so I guess, with Ed now as president, and certainly, do you think that there's hope? Is this a new, gentler, kinder SBC that we're looking at?
No. I think what they did is they staved off the worst. They're still headed on a very narrow trajectory, as we can talk about with the resolutions that were passed, the motions that were passed. This is still a crowd of people who are largely Trump voters, right, who see the world in that way, who are anti-abortion and anti-gay with equal fervor, who really are against teaching race and racism, but have gotten smart enough to realize they can't say that out loud anymore, because they're going to run off the black and brown pastors and churches that are the sole source of growth in the denomination.
Yeah. And, like we said earlier, the vote tally for the presidency was only, or the differential was only 556 votes. It does seem like it's just a matter of time until the ultra conservatives outlast the other faction.
Well, maybe. And here's the interesting thing. So Mike Stone got that many votes because he had one of the most organized, orchestrated presidential campaigns that the SBC has seen in 20 years since our days there, right during the so-called conservative resurgence. So there was a lot of gas put on that. One of the things someone wrote, I can't remember, about Ed Litton was that he had a great ability to campaign without appearing to campaign.
Right.
And that paid off for him. But Mike Stone had all the forces of the Paige Patterson world at his disposal, really advocating for him. I mean, literally bussing in messengers again. We've seen this.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
We've seen this story before, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, paying people to go to the Southern Baptist Convention. That's what they did.
Right.
So that drove up the numbers. So, is that really representative of the whole? I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. A lot happened even before the convention got started. A few weeks ago, it was announced that Russell Moore had stepped down from the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the SBC. There's been some leaked letters from Moore describing some allegations within the executive committee of the Southern Baptist Convention of trying to protect their own when sexual abuse allegations rose within the denomination, as well as some racist, bigoted language that has been used. All that kind of culminated on Monday prior to the convention launching on Tuesday at their executive committee report, when the committee was asked to expand upon an external investigation or inquiry that's taking place. The executive committee hired Guidestone Solutions to come in and to look through that, but they control the parameters of what they can look at. And there were some outside the exec committee, maybe even some inside the exec committee, that wanted a more broad investigation, and they put the kibosh on that quickly.
Yeah, what struck me about this is that Ronnie Floyd's executive committee seems to operate like Bill Barr's Justice Department under the Trump administration. Mm-hmm. It is unbelievable. I mean, it is mind-blowing to think that the executive committee of the SBC, knowing it was about to be investigated by the convention over its handling of this tinderbox of an issue, decided they would preemptively step in and do their own investigation and have the report come back only to them and think they could get away with it. Kudos to the messengers to the Southern Baptist Convention for not giving in to that. Right. And boy, that motion, it didn't just pass, it passed overwhelmingly. Mm-hmm. And it was one of 3 or 4 slapdowns of the executive committee and Ronnie Floyd and his heavy-handed leadership. I, for the life of me, cannot understand why Ronnie Floyd still has a job today.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, that was some positive. It sounds like they are going to take this seriously, investigate what happened. Obviously, this is not only happening in the Southern Baptist Convention; it's happening across, denominations with abuse, and so it's finally that. It's finally, yeah.
Like as a Baptist, though, when everything was sort of on fire in the Catholic Church a few years ago, there were so many Baptists sitting on their high stack of hymnals and pointing. Right.
That's right.
And I just think it's such a comeuppance. Like, maybe there was some more going on within. So I'm glad that there's light being shined here.
Yep, absolutely, 100%. So
yeah, well, and we've got to thank the Houston Chronicle and the Austin American Statesman for really doing the heavy lifting on this. But there's so many stories that have come out and they're still coming out. And again, just so everyone listening understands. The defense the executive committee and others give on this is an interesting one. It is, look, all of our Baptist churches are autonomous. We have no ability to control from a denominational level who is ordained, who's called to serve a church. That's a legitimate defense, but they leaned on that so much that they've just essentially looked the other way when they could have provided some other resources. Right. And, it's a slippery slope for sure, but there's got to be some middle way that no one's discovered yet.
Sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Another issue that seemed to surface at the SBC was race. Saw several messengers wearing no to CRT, heard from the podium, several people denouncing critical race theory. SBC obviously has a history of being a racist organization from its foundation. They've tried to get past that in the last several decades, but predominantly, like all white-run organization, they want to rush to reconciliation without really doing the reparative and restoration type of work before reconciliation can take place. So
I think you're being generous in saying they want to rush to reconciliation, because I'm not sure everyone really wants reconciliation.
Well, they want to hug a person of color. Let's just say that and get a picture taken with it.
They want to say, "I have a black friend." Right. Well, I have a black
there
friend.
You go. There you go. There.
Yeah. And let me repeat something I said earlier. It's very, very important. Without the growth of Black and brown congregations in the SBC, the decline in the SBC would be precipitously more than it already is.
Yeah.
The only growth happening in the Southern Baptist Convention is in congregations of color and multi-ethnic congregations. It is not in the white congregations. And so, this plays out in so many ways when you see persons of color being nominated for first and second vice president positions, but not for president positions in the SBC.
Right.
There's always a tokenism involved here, and we saw that on full display again this year.
Yeah. So, race. I mean, we had several prominent African American pastors openly leave the SBC prior to the convention. Some saying that depending on how things went during the convention, that they were going to leave. Do you see a mass exodus from people of color, the SBC?
No. I think Ed Litton seems to have the track record and the reputation to be someone who is sensitive, in a Southern Baptist sort of way, sensitive on the race issue, and will stave that off. Dwight McKissick is the big bellwether on that, and we've both known Dwight a long time. Dwight loves to be quoted and is someone who's out there all the time speaking on this. Had Mike Stone been elected, I think it was a different issue. Right. So I think they've bought themselves some time on that. But so I was thinking about what I heard over 2 days of the SBC meetings. There are two phrases that were used over and over and over again by all sorts of speakers, and they were critical race theory and the watching world. If I never hear anyone say the watching world again, it's like they encoded it somewhere when they walked in, because all these speakers talked about what the watching world will think of us. That's the exact language they use over and over and over again. So it seems like everyone was suddenly aware that all the eyes of the nation were on them in this annual meeting, and they needed to put up a better front than they had been.
Right.
And so, except for the most extreme people who really wanted to push critical race theory as the boogeyman, most of the folks seemed to understand that they needed to be against critical race theory without calling it critical race theory.
Right.
And that's what we saw come out in the resolutions. Was a way to address this denial of systemic racism without offending Black and brown pastors by attacking critical race theory. So
it's just gaslighting.
it's the same thing, right?
Right.
It's really the same thing.
Yeah. Well, it was an interesting week. I only could get through one day of it, so kudos to you for sticking in today too.
The other thing, just quickly to point out, is the SBC passed the most strident language it has ever passed against abortion. And again, like the Republican Party of today, abortion is the end-all issue here. And this resolution that was passed was so strident that the Resolutions Committee declined to put it forward, despite the fact there had been an advanced campaign for it, and they were handing out copies of it to messengers at the meeting.
Right.
And so this is really significant because it calls for a total and complete and immediate ban on all abortion in all circumstances, no exclusions.
Yeah.
And there were voices within the convention saying, "Wait, this is too extreme."
Right.
but they didn't prevail.
Well, after the last 4 years and the shift of the Supreme Court with the seating of Amy Coney Barrett now, I mean, they are seeing hope that they can get Roe v. Wade repealed. I'm still not there yet. I still think that the court will uphold precedent at that point. We just got word just a moment ago, for the third time, the Supreme Court has upheld Obamacare. So that's, it's a piece of good news. But yeah, I think they see an opening, and they're going to push and push and push until they can get Roe v. Wade in front of the Supreme Court again, so that they, in their opinion, can repeal it. So
I just think it's so interesting that you could be so hide the ball on sexual abuse and so shine a light on abortion.
Mm-hmm.
Like the fact that those two issues are holding the same space speak volumes about where the motives are.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. So sexual abuse is committed mainly by men. Abortion is something that's a decision made by a woman.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's patriarchy.
And there, in
100%.
a nutshell, you define the theology of the Southern Baptist Convention.
It's that simple.
It is that simple.
Yeah.
So, well, Mark, once again, thanks to your team at BNG for doing such a great job covering the Southern Baptist Convention this year. So, I've got one question before we let you go, though, and this is from two Okies to a Texan right now, which we'll claim you as an Okie since you spent some time here. But there is a large border there right now. And it's not just the Red River. How are those thermostat temperatures going down on that grid? Are you really setting your AC at 84 to sleep at night?
No, I mean, we bumped ours up to 78 yesterday.
God, I saw that.
And I'm sitting in the dark a lot.
I saw that news coming out. It's really scary, to be honest with you, because it's hot down in Texas.
It's 100 degrees here and extreme humidity as well. And, but by golly, our governor's going to build his own border wall. So,
well, at least he's got his priorities straight.
And he came down on critical race theory. So clearly he's in the right spot.
Yeah.
Right?
That's right. Yeah. But, your governor's been all concerned about the shortage of Chick-fil-A sauce. So.
Oh, yeah.
Listen, we take no pride in it. We didn't think it could get worse than Mary Fallon. It did.
Oklahoma said, "Hold my iced tea."
Exactly.
Well, Mark, it's always a joy to have you on the show. Appreciate everything you guys do. And to our audience, stay tuned. Autumn and I sat down earlier this week with Reverend June Joplin from Toronto, Ontario. June came out last year, in fact, exactly a year ago this week, identifying as a transgender female, and Reverend Joplin is an absolute delight. So stay tuned for that interview.
Welcome back to Good Faith Weekly. And on this episode, we've got a very special guest with us, the Reverend June Joplin. She's the Associate Pastor of Programs and Congregational Care at Metropolitan Community Church in Toronto, Ontario. 1 year ago this week, June delivered a thorough, compassionate, and bold sermon to her previous church as she came out to her congregation identifying as a transgender woman. Her sermon and accompanying news were met with a tremendous amount of support from her friends and colleagues. However, her church did dismiss her soon after her announcement. She is a member of the Good Faith Media Strategic Advisory Board and a dear friend of mine. We share an affinity for professional hockey, as she is a Carolina Hurricane fan while I bleed Boston Bruins black and gold. We had to wait for both of them to get knocked out of the playoffs before we could conduct this interview because we would have dropped gloves. So, without further ado, Reverend June Joplin, welcome to Good Faith Weekly.
Thank you so much for having me back. It's so lovely to be here again.
And the Canes had a good run. The Bruins had a good run, but we just ran into two buzzsaws. So
it was such a good regular season, and the postseason is just a whole different. It's like a different game, literally top to bottom. So
it is. So
Well, we're glad you're with us. Golly, this must have been a very emotional week for you. As I said in the introduction, that was 1 year ago this week. In fact, we're conducting this interview on the exact anniversary of that incredible sermon that you delivered last year during the pandemic.
I just can't imagine what you must be going through this week. But I mean, you're an incredible minister. I have just been inspired by your story. So as you think back to 1 year ago, what comes to mind?
Um, I think I could just listen to you say things like that for the rest of the episode. Go on. No,
yeah.
no,
I love it.
it was a heck of a week this time last year. As you might imagine, that was a sermon that got quite a bit more work and scrutiny and rewrites. And, it was one that I was running by other friends. It was one that I wrote and rewrote and had been thinking about for a long time. It was a busy week. I hadn't had a chance to come out to my parents before that week. And so when I got the sermon written around Wednesday of that week, I said to my parents, "Hey, I'm going to send you a copy of my sermon for Sunday. I want you to read it and give me a call when you're done." And so that kind of kicked off a stressful couple of days. My mom and dad love me very dearly, but they've struggled a bit with my transition and the news that they have a daughter that they didn't know they had.
Right.
We still actually haven't been in one another's physical presence because of COVID. So
Sure.
that was kind of as tumultuous as the Sunday was, the week before was kind of tough. But I was surrounded that week by dear friends, folks that I've known for 20 years or more. We had a really lovely Zoom call that the night before, and I just tried to soak in their love and support and encouragement. I was practicing live streaming because the sermon itself was posted on my former church's YouTube channel, but then also my personal channel. And so I had been working all week trying to figure out how to do that because I'm not super tech savvy, but managed to get that figured out. And it was a busy week. Wrote 3 letters that week, and as soon as I finished the sermon, I clicked send on letters to my church and letters to the board of directors and letters to my staff, and then just kind of checked out for the week.
Sure.
It was, what I found, and like you said in your introduction, the outpouring of support was overwhelming. I think the folks who were not supportive just they weren't talking to me.
Sure.
Which is, in retrospect, it would have been nice to hear from some of the unsupportive people, but
Right.
at a time when I really needed to feel that support, it was good to just mostly hear nothing but, we're proud of you, we support you, or even like, we don't quite understand this, but we're willing to walk this journey with you. And I was hearing from people that I hadn't talked to in years, and it was a profoundly encouraging day, and it felt just like an enormous weight was being lifted off my shoulders.
Sure.
And here's this huge, huge stressor, this huge piece of trauma that I've been worrying about and carrying around for literally decades. And now I don't have to carry it around anymore. So, praise God.
Yeah. And that's such a great story to hear because we've come such a long way. Granted, we've got a long way to go as a church, but to hear the outpouring of support and love for you after the sermon is just really inspirational to me because, 10 years ago, we certainly wouldn't have been there. And
I think you're right.
you'd probably succumb to, a lot of criticism, outspoken criticism, but people were there quickly to wrap their arms around you and love you. And that's a great testimony to hear. And anybody who's wanting to listen to June's sermon, you can go to pastorjune.com, and the sermon is right there on the homepage. It is one I certainly highly, highly recommend.
Yeah. So unfortunately, after your sermon, your previous congregation let you go. I can't imagine how hard that must have been for you. In many cases, like the one you experienced, the person would leave the universal church altogether, and no one would blame you, but you didn't. Why?
Oh, that's such a good question. I thought about it. Sometimes I wanted to, but I kept getting pulled back in. I fully...
Isn't God just like that?
Yeah, I know. I was talking about this the other day with a couple other colleagues about, I don't know if it's a uniquely Baptist thing, but we talk about this twofold calling, that when we're called into ministry, we have this inner sense that the Spirit is moving within us saying, you should do this with your life. You should be a minister. But then the people of God, in whatever manifestation they take, also say, you should do this. Come be our pastor, or come work with us, come serve with us. And so that sometimes when the inner calling isn't loud and clear, it's that external calling that is the one that gets you through. And I was fully prepared for the sermon I preached a year ago today to be the last one I ever preached, and in a sense, I just wanted to say everything I needed to say. I knew that it was not going to be a June saves her job sermon. So I shifted my priority to, okay, what should I say? What can I say to that hopelessly like repressed and closeted 12-year-old trans girl in youth group like I was in 1992 or whenever, that she would have really needed to hear a pastor say. And so I said all those things and figured, if that's it, that's okay. I've delivered what I feel like is probably the most consequential sermon I'll ever deliver. And it was the last sermon I ever got to preach for that community. But this Sunday, after I lost my job, I was virtually in the pulpit of St. Charles Avenue Baptist in New Orleans. And then the next week I was in First Baptist Worcester, Massachusetts. And the next week, I think I was in 2 different churches. I was in First Baptist Rochester, and I think a church in Toronto. And there was a point somewhere around January, February of 2021 this year where I had been in more churches than there had been Sundays since I got fired. So there were literally weeks that I had to preach like 3 sermons for 3 different churches, and I would just pre-record them and send them because that's something we can do during COVID. So one of the things that's kept me in it is just people have been asking for me. And that's been one of the big shocks, I think, about this past year, is that people want to hear my story. Reporters want to talk to me. I was on television, and that was the strangest thing I think that has ever happened to me. And in a lot of those cases in those churches, I'm standing in pulpits, even virtually, that no trans person has ever filled before. Mm-hmm. And statistically, there are trans folks in those congregations. There are folks who are questioning their gender identity. There are folks that are questioning their orientation. There are folks who have trans loved ones. And so just to occupy those spaces and to be there for that representation, that's been one of the big things that's kept me doing this work.
June, one of the things that I immensely appreciate about you, your story is certainly unique. It's one that I've already said before, I am inspired by on a daily basis. But your ability to rise above a congregational rejection and to immediately embrace this greater calling upon your life, or this different calling upon your life. As far as now, your congregation is pretty much global. And so you're preaching on the internet, you're preaching in different churches across the country. To me, the reason you were able to do that is because you had a strong and real sense of your ecclesiology, of who the church really is, that the church is broken, the church is fallen, that the church is also beautiful at the same time. And that in this family that we call congregation and the church, that even if you're rejected by one, you will be embraced by another that quickly. And I think that's where we are as a church. And I've heard you talk about this throughout your career. Your ecclesiology is just astounding and lovely. And I think you had a great grasp of what the church is about that helped you through this process.
I think this last year has given me experiential encounter with that church that is broad and deep and wide. And when I was in seminary, I really fell head over heels in love with church history. And a lot of church historians will tell you that church history is where you kind of get to sneak in like the really progressive stuff, because church history, there's been a lot of pretty narrow, pretty unfortunate, violent, you name it, misogynistic, colonial, homophobic, transphobic. Like you can point to just about anything over the history of the church, and maybe even that's the larger current. But there's always these undercurrents. Mm-hmm. I need to talk to them about this, but I've had a few conversations with Bishop-elect Reverend Dr. Megan Rohr, okay. And I want to use all of their titles because it's a pretty big deal that they're about to become the first openly trans bishop in probably the world, but certainly in the Evangelical Lutheran Church. And they talk about, and they always say, well, I'm the first trans bishop since the Nicene Council. And I always wonder, okay, can you explain that to me? But like, really, no, we're not new. And when you have that broader understanding of just how big the church is, you kind of realize that, you're not alone, even if you feel as a trans minister that gosh, I must be the only one out there. Well, no, you're not. Sometimes I think my story has been told with this degree of novelty. And I mean, it's kind of uncommon, but I'm often quick to point out that, I've been repeating the story of, for instance, Nancy Leddens, who was a Roman Catholic priest who transitioned in like 1976, 1977. When she transitioned, just the way it was covered in the media, we would consider extremely transphobic by contemporary standards. She faced death threats. I think her car was firebombed, things that I never had to deal with. Of course, she never served as a Catholic priest again, but about a decade later, when she kind of eased back into congregational life, she was a lay minister at Wedgwood Baptist Church in Charlotte, North Carolina. And so Nancy's that reminder that there have literally been trans clergy for my entire life, and then even before I was born. And so, the church is a lot broader. If you're rejected one place, you'll probably be embraced another.
So over the last year, what has been the best piece of advice that someone has given you?
Oh, goodness. That's a tough one. As a minister, you show so much grace to other people. It sounds like you need to show yourself the same grace that you're showing other people.
Love that.
And that was actually, I mean, like a 23-year-old MSW student at a therapy intake said that to me. And it's probably the most profound and a transformational piece of advice that I've gotten throughout my journey of transition, because we put so much pressure on us. I think as clergy, we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to kind of conform to the profile, and we can't be vulnerable, and we can't show weakness, and we can't struggle. And but yeah, as a church, we've got to be the kind of community where those kinds of things are okay.
Yeah, and if there's a message that clergy need to hear right now after this year of pandemic and being shut out of their congregations, it's that one. The clergy, as they have been extending grace, need to extend that grace to themselves, because there's a lot of them who are struggling right now.
Sure.
Considering leaving their pulpits, just having a tough time. So our prayers go out to them, but also what a great piece of advice. Give yourself grace.
Yeah. And that's true for mamas and daddies and grandparents and teenagers. Like, if you're living this life, like, extend the same grace to yourself that you extend to everyone else. If you're a nice person, if you're not a nice person, then maybe extend a little more to everyone.
If you're not a nice person, you're everybody. If you're not a nice person, you might be in Nashville this week attending a certain meeting.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
Throw some shade.
Maybe.
No, I'm just saying.
Okay, so looking back over the last year, you now find yourself in a new congregation and embracing some new opportunities. With Pride Month underway in June, does, pun intended, right? Does this year have any new meaning for you?
So I'm doing a lot of guest preaching in June, and again, like showing yourself that grace, what I've realized is, I don't have 4 or 5 sermons to give on Pride Month. And so as folks have reached out to me and said, hey, can you preach for us for Pride? I've answered that. I'm happy to do that. I have a sermon that I think will work really well. I'll pre-record it. I'll send it to you the Friday night before. Don't ask me to help you with worship planning. Don't ask me what hymns I want. That's not my job. Get your own folks to do that. I'm going to send you a sermon on Friday evening, and it's going to be the same one that I sent every other church in June. But it's a good one, I promise. And so I've been doing a lot of that. But the first time I recorded my Pride Month sermon for June, at the end of the sermon, as I was kind of closing out and saying, thanks be to God, amen, and all that, I said, happy Pride. And the moment I hit stop on the record button, I realized what I had just said in the context of preaching. And I was moved almost to tears. I get to that place every now and then. A couple of weeks ago, before June, I was at MCC Toronto, and myself and Reverend Jeff and Reverend Dina, our pastoral team, were recording a communion liturgy for Pride Month. And here's a gay pastor, a lesbian pastor, a trans pastor, all standing at the communion table wearing our rainbow-colored stoles and trans-colored stoles and masks, and saying, you're welcome at this table, no matter who you are.
Sounds like actually heaven.
Yeah. And I mean, there was a moment when I was standing there behind that communion table, and it kind of hit me, June, look where you are right now.
Mm-hmm.
What a beautiful moment.
And it just kind of, it just hits me in these waves, and it's overwhelming.
Yeah.
I was in a board meeting at MCC Toronto. I'm an associate pastor. I don't go to all the board meetings, but I go now and then. And I realized this is the first church board meeting that I have ever attended where I'm not sitting here and in the back of my head thinking, okay, like what's my plan for talking to these people about becoming more open and affirming? Mm-hmm. I don't have to have that conversation anymore. I don't have to worry about how we might actually do right by welcoming all people, because I'm there. And so it means a lot, even though in our case, all the Pride stuff is happening virtually. It's such a beautiful and cathartic and healing thing to be part of a community of faith that really sees the sacredness of Pride Month. I spoke about this in the sermon, I preached yesterday for MCC, and that's on our YouTube channel. And I talked about how, last year, a year ago today, I preached a sermon about seeking treasure, and the treasure I was seeking was simply my identity, my authentic self. And this year, the treasure I'm seeking is really that sense of pride. That's, our theme this year for Pride is unashamed and fiercely proud. And, sometimes I struggle with that sense of like unashamedness and fierce pride, because I used shame as a coping mechanism for decades. It was the thing that kept me safe. It was the thing that helped me fit in. It was the thing that prevented me from getting fired or crushed or whatever. And so it's very difficult to then one day preach this sermon and say, this is who I am. And okay, the shame's all gone now. It just dissipates.
Yeah. Sure.
So this thing that has really helped you adapt becomes maladaptive now. And so I'm working on moving past it. But pride is really, I think some folks in some faith circles in some corners of the church kind of get hung up on the language of pride because, our faith teaches us that pride is a sin. And, we're not talking about like arrogance or haughtiness or some of that stuff that you read about. You're just, pride in the context of the celebrations in June is really about taking all that stuff out there that like bad theology or the society or, your family of origin or whatever has said, you really ought to be ashamed of yourself or who you love or how you love or how you want to dress. You really ought to be ashamed of yourself. Pride is that thing inside of you that makes you say, no, I'm not going to be ashamed of myself. And it's not about like, it's not about arrogance. It's about just saying no to shame. And
it's the absence of shame.
Yeah. And I'm working on it. I'm getting there.
So it's the absence of shame. It's also, to me, pride represents this incredible boldness to say to community, I will no longer be ignored. I will
Yeah.
no longer let you put a barrier between who I am and the rest of the world. And it's this, the world is going to see me. And when I think about scripture, and one of the things that I've always been inspired by in the New Testament is when Jesus would come into a town and the people he would minister to, it always began the same way. Jesus saw them.
Yeah.
And it's an endearing relational moment where these people were seen for who they truly were. They weren't as culture had defined them or put them in the box. Jesus saw them for who they truly were and loved them and inspired them and ministered to them. And to me, that's what pride is. Pride, our LGBTQ plus friends are simply saying, I am no longer going to be ignored, and the world is going to see me for who I am. And that is simple humanity. That is a simple human right,
Yeah.
something that everybody should be able to celebrate. So it's one of the most moving months in the year for me. Now, I'm going to switch gears a little bit, June.
right.
You are a Canadian citizen, and we all...
No, not yet. I'm
You're
a
not.
permanent resident. Yeah.
You're a permanent resident.
I'll be a citizen this time next year.
Okay, we're
sure.
still jealous about your healthcare system up there, but that's another podcast for another time. But I think you're still a citizen here in the United States, correct?
I am a U.S. citizen. Yeah.
Okay. Well, this year, 2021, has been a treacherous year for state legislatures. They have introduced over 100 bills decreasing the rights of transgender citizens. As a permanent resident of Canada, a U.S. citizen, as a person of faith, what do you think is going on? What is the reasoning behind this increase in so many anti-transgender bills?
I think maybe the simplest answer is that folks need an issue for like the point of the spear in the culture wars, And as maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, that issue was more like, gay marriage.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of settled law now, I don't know where it is in the States necessarily, but I know like the Conservative Party here in Canada, about the time I moved up here, I want to say around 2015, 2016, removed opposition to gay marriage from its party platform. And so it was like they were saying, okay, it's done. We might as well be fighting against, desegregation, because as society progresses towards a more liberated, freer version of itself, there's always going to be some group of people kind of on the front lines of that struggle. And this decade or so, it seems to be trans rights and trans folks, and
it almost seems as though they're targeting trans children under 18 with sports and things like that. And you and I had a conversation many months ago about how well Canadian junior hockey does in training and accepting people and children from the LGBT community, and how they train their coaches on how to be sensitive to that as well.
Yeah. Are we still?
Are we there?
Yeah, I can kind of hear you. I think
when we start talking about like people picking on trans kids, God's like, mm-mm.
Yeah, that's right.
That's
one of the, I've spoken at times about how, up until I was 38, 39, almost 40 years old, I would have said, I'm absolutely not a trans person, because I just didn't understand what being trans was. But one of the first places that I learned about the concept of like gender and gender identity being kind of separate and gender expression being something totally else was in sensitivity training that I had to take in order to manage my oldest son's hockey team back in like 2017, 2018. And what happened was that about a decade ago, there was a young trans man named Jesse Thompson who was being made to change in the girls' change room, and brought the Ontario brought the Ontario Hockey Federation up for a violation of the Human Rights Code. And he won his case, and one of the results of the case is that coaches now had to learn about how to protect kids from the worst parts of discrimination. And so as an adult volunteer in youth hockey in Ontario, you've got to learn about like sharing pronouns, and you've got to learn about how to differentiate between, sex assigned at birth and gender identity and gender expression, in such a way that, they even say like, we're not training you to become an advocate necessarily. We're not training you to change people's minds. We are training you so that you can make kids feel safe and welcome. Because I think I remember the statistic. I think this is probably from the Trevor Project or some organization like that says something. It's a pretty high number. I'd say 2/3 to maybe 80% of LGBTQ plus kids feel unsafe in sports environments, uncomfortable coming out to coaches or teammates, unable to kind of be who they really are. And one of the things that keeps being said, especially in the context of the debates down in the States, is, sport is a human right. The option of just saying, no, just don't play is really not a viable option. So I was impressed with that. And I did some writing about that for Good Faith Media, because as I was taking that webinar, essentially, I was thinking a couple of things. First, I was thinking, wow, this is amazing. Second, I was thinking, Sunday school teachers and youth leaders and people that work with children and youth in churches ought to take the same training. And then third, I was thinking, oh gosh, June, you should be thinking about this stuff for yourself a little, because this is teaching you about parts of yourself that you have ignored for too long.
Sure. And that's, again, I was so inspired by that story that you told me. Hopefully we can get there in the States at some point where we're providing mandatory training just to help kids feel safe and secure wherever they are, and that every kid deserves that right. Well, speaking of that, I got one last question before I hand you off to Autumn and she asks our final question. It's been a year since you came out and again delivered that inspirational sermon. You must know that there are a lot of people who have been listening to that sermon, watching that sermon over the last year. Some individuals who are struggling with maybe their sexual orientation or their gender identity. As a minister, June, what piece of advice would you have for them right now as they're contemplating what to do next?
God is with you in the questioning. If you feel like you are stuck between two places, if you feel like you're in the wilderness, God is there. I believe in a God who Scripture reveals, our history reveals, is present in a particular way in those liminal spaces and those in-between spaces. And there's all kinds of grace and all kinds of provision in those wilderness places. If you're where I was, you might be thinking like, I don't know what comes next. I don't know how to plan for what comes next. And that's okay too. Again, give yourself grace and put one foot in front of the other. That's been my mantra.
Love it.
I've been drawn to like the story of the Exodus throughout this journey, and how it is kind of it's the classic story in Scripture of God making a way where there is no way. It's a story about folks who escape an awful way of being and end up, they're not delivered immediately to like an easy situation. It's hard again. And a lot of them say, well, let's go back to Egypt. It sucked, but at least, we had roofs over our head. We had food to eat.
Sure. So,
God makes a way where there is no way, and put one foot in front of the other and keep doing that and keep doing that and keep doing that. And in time, you'll be astounded by the ground that you'll cover. You don't have to see everything now. You don't have to have everything figured out now. You don't have to have all the answers now. But just take the next step.
I love that. Take the next step. What great words. Reverend June Joplin, Associate Pastor of Programs and Congregational Care at Metropolitan Community Church in Toronto, Ontario. Her website is pastorjune.com. You can reach out to her and follow her across social media and invite her to preach at your church. I guarantee you will not regret it. Reverend June, thank you so much for being with us at Good Faith Weekly. But before we let you go, Autumn's got one last question for you.
I think you've given us at least 6 answers to this already, in my opinion. So you can just rewind and listen to everything again. But as you know, our tagline at Good Faith Media is "There's more to tell." So in light of our conversation today, what is your more to tell?
One of the things that Mitch said a couple of minutes ago that syncs up with my story, it being a story of being rejected in one place and embraced in another. There are lots of places in the church that will embrace you. There are more convictionally accepting Christians in the United States than there are those who are not. Now, we might not all go to churches that are that way, but we should. I recently heard a pastor describe open and affirming churches as unicorn churches, and that's a cute idea, but I think it's also a bad idea because we're not rare, we're everywhere.
There you go.
I have preached in church, I preached in a little church in Catawba County, North Carolina, where I'm from, that began as a Bible study in an office above a gay bar in Catawba County, North Carolina. Everywhere you go, there are faith communities that you can belong to, either as an unashamed ally or as someone who's out as part of the LGBTQ plus community. And those places are there. If you are not at an open and affirming church, why not? It's not too late to leave your church and go to one where all are welcome means all are welcome. And I want to challenge you to do that.
I love that.
Because they're out there.
They are indeed. Well, Reverend Joplin, thank you again for being with us on Good Faith Weekly. It's been a delight.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
To our listeners, we thank you for tuning in once again. Until Autumn and I get back to you next week, keep living good faith.
And happy Pride!
Happy Pride!
Happy Pride!